I welcome you all to the Holland Land Office Museum for the next installment of our guest speaker series. We're very happy to have Derrick Pratt back again this year from the Erie Canal Museum. Felt only appropriate to have somebody from the Erie Canal Museum this year with bicentennial, so he is here to talk about the conception of the Erie Canal.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me again. I keep asking me back, so I guess that's a good sign. Glad to be here on the bicentennial month of the canal as well. Just 2 more weeks until we hit the canal's official 200th birthday.
Wow.
Yes, October 26th. Real quick, how many people have been to the museum in Syracuse before?
Not yet.
All right. Well, that's all right. We're open 7 days a week from 10 to 4, so you can always stop by. This is a great year to do it. It is the bicentennial. We're also coming up on gingerbread season. The museum, this is the 40th anniversary of our gingerbread gallery. We have a whole room that gets filled up with about 40 to 50 locally made gingerbread creations, ranging from little kids to professional bakers. It's a great holiday tradition.
Go to the one in Rochester. Eastman House.
Yes, yeah, we're a lot like that one. We've actually partnered with them. But today, I'm not here to talk about gingerbread. Here to talk about the Erie Canal and how they came up with the idea. Because nowadays, it's 2025, we're celebrating the bicentennial of the canal's completion, but there was a lot leading up to that. And we'll start the story actually at the end of it. So here's a map of the United States in about 1850, with most of its major canals charted out. You'll see here, by 1850, America was crisscrossed by thousands of miles of artificial waterways. But there was a time, just about 25 years before, where none of these existed. The Erie Canal will inspire the growth of almost all of these canals. So how did we get to this point? Why were we, by the time of the Civil War, overwhelmed by canals? Today we're going to answer a couple questions. Why did they build the Erie Canal in the first place? And what was the process that New York especially had to go through to ultimately start building the Erie Canal? And this story that we need to tell really begins about 250 million years ago when the Appalachian Mountain Range is formed. They get pushed up when tectonic plates hit each other and stuff. I don't know, I'm not a scientist. That's a really minor part of the story, though a major, critical part, because they're going to go all the way along the coast of North America. And then we'll fast forward quite a ways to about 10 to 12,000 years ago. That's the end of the last ice age. And most of us probably know that most of upstate New York's geography is in some way shaped by the glaciers that occurred in the last ice age. Well, critical to our story is when those glaciers started to melt. All that water that was coming off the glaciers formed this giant lake, what's known today as Great Lake Iroquois, by geologists. And you can imagine it almost as Lake Ontario plus Oneida Lake, and even some of the tops of the Finger Lakes make up this ancient lake. Nowadays, all of those bodies of water drain out to the ocean via the St. Lawrence River. However, at that point in time, the glaciers are melting. They're not gone yet. So there are still glaciers covering the St. Lawrence. So that water needed to find a new place to get to the ocean from. And did that right here in the Mohawk River Valley and the Hudson as well. This canyon gets carved out by all of this glacial meltwater. And this critical passage forms in the mountains. Between Georgia and Maine, there are no other passes under 600 feet in elevation between the eastern seaboard and the interior of the continent. This is an incredibly important transportation route, pretty much from its formation. That's because this is when also the first human beings start arriving in what is today New York, following herds of game along the shores of that ancient lake. They'll eventually take advantage of these naturally occurring waterways to form the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, whose land the Erie Canal will largely be built across. Europeans, when they start arriving in the 1600s, also recognized the importance of this route between the interior of the continent and the east coast. So let's talk a little more about this route through the Mohawk Valley that could connect you to the Great Lakes. Now, if you're coming from the ocean, you enter the Hudson right at New York City. The Hudson is a very calm waterway. Between New York and Albany, there's only about a 2-foot difference in elevation. You can easily sail a ship up the Hudson. And then if you want to go further inland, theoretically, you can take a left turn here at the Mohawk, right? Wait a second for you folks to sit back. Oh, no problem. Well,
Really good number.
hey, you barely missed anything. Well, you have missed 250 million years.
Do we have that in set replay?
Yeah, they're holding it. So, but you can't actually just turn into the Mohawk River. The Mohawk is a very different river from the Hudson. It is marked by a lot of different waterfalls and rapids, including critically the Great Falls at Cohoes, which are right about here. These waterfalls are about the size of Niagara Falls in height. So really you would actually travel overland from Albany to Schenectady, which is, Schenectady becomes this important point because it is the first really navigable point on the Mohawk River. You then take your boat up the Mohawk. You have a number of different obstructions in the river, including a smaller set of falls that they're creatively named Little Falls, plus a bunch of rapids and other smaller waterfalls in places like German Flats. Then you would get here, what's labeled Fort Williams on this map. This is the Great Carrying Place. This is where the Mohawk River kind of turns north up towards the Adirondacks and stops being navigable, really, or at least useful for trade. And you carry your boat about 1 to 3 miles to this little stream here, Wood Creek, where you could put in and then take that into Oneida Lake, cross the lake, and then you would hit the Oneida River, which you can either take the Oswego River, which takes you up to Lake Ontario, or the Seneca River, which can take you down to the Finger Lakes if you so choose. And every one of those obstructions, you are pulling your boat out of the water and everything in it. This isn't that bad if you're in like a canoe, but if you're trying to produce for markets, this is horrible for you because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to remove your boat. It also limits the size of how large your boat can be, and therefore also how much stuff you can carry. And so it's going to take a long time, use a lot of manpower, and critically, that costs a lot of money if you want to move anything. Estimates say that a trip from Buffalo to New York using this system, that takes about 30 days or so. Costs around $100 a month. So it's not super efficient. By the way, Fort Williams, I mentioned, you see it there on the map. You probably know it better as Fort Stanwix, which will become much better known as. And it's there to guard this critical passageway between Wood Creek and the Mohawk. Also, I mentioned that portage from Mohawk to Wood Creek, 1 to 3 miles. Wood Creek is itself a very unreliable waterway. If you have a dry season like today, it's barely navigable. It's also pretty narrow. Trees and stuff could fall fully across the stream. So that's the natural transportation system. People are more likely, actually, at this point in time, to take this route up the Hudson, right? This is what like General Burgoyne does in the Revolution. And you can go through Lake George, up to Lake Champlain, and then up to the St. Lawrence that way. That's an alternate route. So that's where we're at when colonization sort of begins. That's the transportation route. And pretty early on, people start recognizing that this is not an ideal transportation route, though it has some natural advantages, and those could be improved upon. Generally credited with one of the first ideas for improving the waterways of New York is this man, Cadwallader Colden. He's Scottish, and he's a part of like the Scottish Enlightenment, but he's kind of a bit of a know-it-all too. He actually writes a thing trying to prove Isaac Newton wrong in his discovery of calculus. Turns out he was wrong, but anyway, not that important. He's this scientist guy. And he's, the impression I get is he also kind of annoyed British officials a bit, so they were like, you know what, you can go to this new colony of ours. They've only relatively recently taken over from the Dutch. He's made Surveyor General of the province of New York in 1720. And his first job is to explore this new colony that the British have obtained from the Dutch and go check out and report back what he finds in what is today upstate New York. So he does that for a few years. New York's western boundaries are kind of nebulous at the time. He actually goes all the way to like Lake Michigan comes back and writes a report up to the British authorities about what he's seen. And critically, he will recommend that they invest in improving the natural waterways of this Mohawk River and Oswego River system, building small canals and dams, or else, he warns, the British will lose control of the fur trade to the French up in Montreal. However, at the time, the British, they're not super invested in New York. They have much more profitable colonies in places like Virginia, for instance, so they kind of ignore this. And Colden is proved correct. The French do dominate the fur trade in the Great Lakes until the 7 years or French and Indian War leads the British to take control of Canada, and then they've got both places as well. But Colden is kind of the first person to put it out there that we need to improve these waterways. And there is some archaeological evidence starting to emerge that at least local farmers were taking it upon themselves to build small canals, especially in some of the more challenging areas where, for instance, the Mohawk River kind of bends, and they were like, we can just cut off a neck of land with like a mile-long small canal. So there is a little canal building going on at this time. The real difference, though, comes with the American Revolution. The whole area of New York is consumed by the war. The Mohawk Valley is a critical front in the war. You have in 1779 the Sullivan-Clinton campaign as well, where American armies march around the Finger Lakes, burning around 40 Haudenosaunee villages and about 100,000 bushels of corn, which gives them this justification after the war to say that the land has been quote-unquote cleared in a lot of ways. And Washington, in the final months of the war, he's hanging out in Newburgh, New York, waiting for the British to officially surrender. And he's a surveyor by trade, so he also goes up into this area to check it out and see, what has been won in this war. And he likes what he sees. He sees all of these natural waterways, and he even says, sometimes he's credited with giving New York the nickname, the Empire State, because he sees this gap in the Mohawk Valley and declares that this land is destined to be the seat of empire, right here. So he's impressed by what he sees, though he's also, critically, a Virginian. Lives on the Potomac River. During this trip, he also writes a letter to his friend and fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, saying, hey, we need to get to work improving the Potomac Canal, or else New York is going to surpass us as the most important state in this new country. But he sits on this for a while. The next year, after America officially declares peace in 1783, in 1784, you get one of your first proposals in the New York State Legislature to improve the Mohawk River. This is made by Christopher Cowles on November 3rd, 1784. He wants a survey of the Mohawk River with the eye towards later improving the river. Cowles is often described as this visionary, man ahead of his time. He also had ideas for how to get New York City a clean supply of drinking water, a lot of these really grand ideas. But the young nation often doesn't have the money or the technical know-how in how to actually implement them. Cowles himself recognizes this, and he has a supposed quote that, had I been born a hatter, men would have been born without heads. About his luck. So Cowles puts this plan to the state legislature, and they are intrigued by it. They actually will approve some money in the supply bill of 1785 to do some investigating into whether or not the Mohawk River can be improved. And actually the survey comes back positive, though it's done a bit haphazardly. They do not approve enough money to really do it particularly well. But the survey is done. However, it doesn't go really any further than that. America in the 1780s, early 1790s is really in quite a fiscal predicament. They have all these war debts. The state doesn't have the money to do a lot to improve the canal. However, that's when this man enters our scene, Elkanah Watson. He's a really interesting character. He's from Rhode Island originally. He gets wrapped up in the Revolutionary movement. He's a Freemason, which gets him a lot of good connections with fellow Masons in the early Republic. Critically, he's bringing messages between the Continental Congress and Ben Franklin in France. That's what he spent most of the war doing. And then after the war, throughout his life, he just keeps coming up with get-rich-quick schemes, kind of. He's probably most famous today in history for inventing the county fair, and also he invented that because he also introduced the merino sheep to America, and he saw county fairs as a good vehicle to sell his sheep to people and showcase them. But that's later in the story. He goes on to this land speculating thing in North Carolina. Critically, that's what he's doing. That's sort of failing. And he stops at one of his fellow revolutionaries' homes. That would be George Washington's house of Mount Vernon, also in 1885. Stops in for dinner with Washington. This is back when he could just do that, I guess, stop in at the house of the most important man in the country. He was apparently unannounced. From what I've read, Washington's personal diary he was annoyed that Elkanah Watson was there. Nonetheless, though, he's a good host. So they started talking about some of their mutual interests, which include internal improvements. That's kind of what today we just call infrastructure. Things like roads and canals. And Washington apparently tells Watson about what he has seen in New York a couple of years earlier, the potential there for improvements to the Mohawk River system. And after a few years, Watson does head up to New York. Those ventures he had in North Carolina kind of go sideways on him, so he heads up north. Again, he's a well-connected guy. He finds some important backers, most notably General Philip Schuyler, one of New York's first U.S. senators, the father-in-law to Alexander Hamilton. And with his backing and that of largely Federalists, on March 24th, 1791, he gets the state to authorize a new survey of the Mohawk Valley. This one's going to be well funded because it has good support behind it. It comes back positive, and the next year, in 1792, the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Corporation will be founded. This is a critical precursor to the Erie Canal.
Can I ask where that waterfalls is?
This is Cohoes. Great question.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, so this is that big obstacle they have. This is one of the obstacles that the Western Inland will never be able to surmount. I have it here, I guess. Yeah, and the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Corporation's entire purpose is to improve the Mohawk River through a series of dams, small canals, and locks around obstructions to improve the navigation of the Mohawk River and also connect it to that Wood Creek system. And technically they have rights actually all the way to the Seneca River for its water. It is a private corporation. Its co-presidents are Elkanah Watson and Philip Schuyler, but they get stockholders from almost all of the prominent families in New York. One person who buys a single share is a young man by the name of DeWitt Clinton. More on him later, but he's just there's kind of a craze when it starts out. Everybody who's anybody's buying stock in this company. However, the way they did stock back then was a bit different. They were kind of like IOUs, and you could choose just not to pay the money on them. It's complicated how the financing works, which, spoiler alert, hurts their system. At first, so the surveys are positive for improving the Mohawk, but there are a lot of challenges for the Western Inland. The first is that there are no trained engineers in the United States at the time, at least trained civil engineers. At first, they say, okay, I guess our solution will be Philip Schuyler. You've been to England before, you've seen a canal, you also have military engineering experience, you're our chief engineer. And Schuyler is the head engineer of the canal for a few years, and he actually makes some early progress. A small canal is built that connects Rome on the Mohawk River to Wood Creek. This is incredibly important, and Schuyler also oversees the construction of 5 locks around Little Falls. And he takes a very active role. He's up to apparently his waist in water, trying to direct the works. However, Schuyler is 70 years old at the time, which in the 1700s is he's 120, getting in waist deep water. Not great for his health. He eventually will step away from the company. So then they have to figure out who's going to be the engineer. They're also on harder to engineer things, like these riverine dams that they're supposed to build. They have plans to maybe someday get around these falls here at Cohoes. More experience is needed, and there aren't any experienced engineers in America. So they start looking around for European experienced canals builders. And they land on William Weston, who has actually participated in some other river improvement projects in America, notably the Schuylkill River out in Pennsylvania. I saw one historian describe William Weston as early America's favorite, overpaid, underperforming European engineer. As you can tell, he doesn't do great. But the odds are stacked against him, as it is. One the Mohawk River is a very wild and unpredictable river. In the springtime, especially when the snow melts, the floods can be horrible on the Mohawk, and they'll often wash away some of the improvements that are made, especially these dams. But the other reason that those things are washing away is because the Western Inland is critically always short of money, and as a result, kind of cuts corners a lot. And this is it's largely due to the fact that it is a private corporation attempting to do this. Like I said, it's stockholders that own this company, and they want to make money off of the canal. However, the way infrastructure projects work, you have to invest a ton of money into them before you can ever make any money back. The ultimate plan is to collect tolls on the small canals and locks. However, that takes several years, and it costs tons of money to build those things. So when there are no returns the first several years, those high-profile investors, they start to pull out. They're taking their money back. They're not paying those kind of IOUs that they have. And then, because they're short on money, they cut corners to save money. Notably, they're going to build the locks on the Western Inland out of wood instead of out of stone. I assume you know what happens when you get wood wet, especially for sustained periods of time. They start to rot. So these locks are going to rot away in about 5 to 10 years generally and stop being functional, and they have to build locks again. So these early cost-cutting measures actually cost them more money in the end because they have to just keep rebuilding them. Likewise, those dams, William Weston can't build things to the exact specifications he would like because he's chronically, kind of short on money. He does, however, bring on a assistant engineer at one point in the project, a young man who's moved to Rome, a guy by the name of Benjamin Wright, who will be important later in our story as well. So the Western Inland is relatively unsuccessful for a lot of the reasons we talked about, though it is an important precursor. It's this early we learn a lot of lessons from the Western Inland. It does actually reduce shipping times and costs by about a third from what they were before it opened, so it's not useless, but it pretty much never makes money. There are only 2 years in the whole history of the thing. It lasts for about 30 years that it makes money. Any guesses? Here in Batavia, I thought we might know the 2 years. It's the War of 1812, because they're able to kind of price gouge the government on tolls to get stuff out to the frontier, by the Niagara frontier. So yeah, that's the Western Inland. Not super successful, but an important trading ground. So this brings us up to about 1800. And I think it's important for us to kind of zoom out a little, look at the context of the United States in 1800. Despite the challenges of moving west, there's still increasing westward expansion. More and more people are moving across, more and more American settlers are moving across the Appalachian Mountains. However, those settlers in places like Kentucky, the Ohio territories, their trade, rather than going to American ports, is instead being diverted into the Great Lakes. And it's much easier, rather than going through that whole system down to New York, except that what Cadwalader Colden had been warning about 100 years before. You can instead just ship stuff up the St. Lawrence to Montreal. So America is losing trade to Canada. And there's a growing east-west divide. The lack of commercial ties between the East Coast and the interior of the continent are growing more and more. People in the Midwest are starting to say, why do we have to pay taxes and stuff to these states on the East Coast? What are they doing for us, kind of? And there are these thoughts that America is going to split in half, not north-south, as it will do later in American history, but east-west. This is really driven home in 1805 when Aaron Burr is arrested for a potential treason plot where he may have been trying to break off some section of America or possibly Texas to form his own country. So there's this great fear that the country is going to be split in half, possibly. This is also the age of Thomas Jefferson and Jeffersonian democracy, which really emphasizes the idea of the yeoman farmer. This idea that the ideal American citizen is a guy who sets out into the frontier, builds his own little farm, and that's who you want. But you can't really do that in a lot of these states. On the East Coast, all the land's accounted for. So this is further pushing more people west. And the other thing to note, during this era, 1800 or so, anyone know what's happening, especially in Europe at the time?
After Napoleon?
Yeah, Napoleonic Wars. So, as you know, all of Europe is tearing itself apart. America has a great opportunity. They're selling both sides of the wars generally. A lot of supplies, especially food. It's estimated that about 80% of the Duke of Wellington's army in Spain is being fed on American wheat, which makes America a ton of money. We have one of the primary ways the government raises money at the time is with tariffs. In fact, by the middle of the Jefferson administration, America is actually running a budget surplus. They have more money than they know what to do with. So actually, Jefferson tells his Secretary of the Treasury, figure out what to do with all of this extra money that we have coming in from Europe. And that's a man by the name of Albert Gallatin, a Swiss immigrant, the longest serving Secretary of Treasury in history. And he comes up with this, what's known as the Gallatin Plan in 1807. He proposes a series of federally funded infrastructure projects, roads, canals, and river improvements, as well as harbor improvements. So he delivers this in 1807, and it puts a lot of these gears into motion. This is a critical year. There's now, the federal government has shown support for funding internal improvements. And this has a huge impact, especially in upstate New York. People are kind of set afire by this new report. Also, by the actions of this man. This is Jesse Hawley. He was from Connecticut. He had settled around Geneva, and he was milling and attempting to ship out grain from the Finger Lakes. However, that business doesn't do that great. In fact, he ends up in 1807 going to debtor's prison in Canandaigua. However, while he is there, he has some time to reflect on why his business failed. He largely blames the transportation systems that led him to that. And he's able to look at maps of New York as well as some recently published scientific writings. And he comes to the conclusion that a canal from Lake Erie to the Hudson River would be a great idea. However, he is in debtor's prison, so doesn't think that's going to look great in trying to make this argument. So he writes under the assumed name of Hercules and publishes 12 essays in the Genesee Messenger calling for a canal across the state. These essays will eventually wind their ways into the hands of some of the most prominent New Yorkers, and he is often given a lot of credit for coming up with the idea of the canal. Also, upstate New York sees the creation of the canal ticket. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans in upstate New York agreed to put aside their differences for this election. The most critical issue on the ballot for upstate New Yorkers is building a canal. So they create this fusion ticket that sweeps into office in the legislature. on a canal ticket. One of the people elected under that canal ticket is Joshua Foreman of Syracuse, a major land speculator in the area. And on February 4th, 1808, he proposes a survey to see the feasibility of building a canal from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. He wants to check out both the Lake Ontario and the Lake Erie route. And on April 11th, the state legislature approves $600 for a survey. Unfortunately, that's only enough money to do the Ontario route.
Yeah.
However, they do ask James Geddes, who will be the survey, like, hey, out of your own pocket, could you please survey Western New York as well? We will pay you back at some point. People trusted the government a lot more at the time because Geddes says, like, sure, I'll do that, and does, and finds that you can actually build a canal to Lake Erie as well. Plus, the other reason New York isn't funding this as much is because, Thomas Jefferson has just said in his State of the Union address, like, we want to fund states to build these internal improvements. So they think they can get federal dollars. So in January of 1809, Foreman goes to meet with Thomas Jefferson in his waning days in office and propose this canal across New York State. And this is what Thomas Jefferson says to him. One of the most infamous responses in the canal's history. Critically, this end here. You talk of making a canal of 350 miles through the wilderness. It is little short of madness to think of at this day. So Thomas Jefferson didn't really think this was going to happen. And for 1809, that kind of kills it. It becomes very apparent that federal money that they were relying on wasn't going to materialize. So fast forward another year to 1810, and New York has a critical gubernatorial election. That will see Jonas Platt attempt to take on the very popular Democratic Republican incumbent, Daniel D. Tompkins. New York State is a firmly Democratic Republican state at this point in time. It has only elected one Federalist ever in its history, John Jay, in the early 1790s. The previous gubernatorial election, a Federalist hadn't even bothered to run for governor. However, Platt, he's a smart politician. He knows that the Federalists might not be the most popular party in New York, but perhaps he can come up with a bold vision for New York that will inspire the people of the state to vote for him for governor. And they want one that's bipartisan, that can hopefully get some Democratic Republicans to support this Federalist challenger. And he's approached by a fellow Federalist, Thomas Eddy, who's also the treasurer of the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company, who says, hey, this canal idea seems pretty popular. Maybe you should try running on that. Platt agrees. However, politics isn't that different from back then as it is today, right? When one party proposes something, the other party will often be like, no, that's a horrible idea. I hate it. Doesn't matter what it is a lot of times. And they fear that will happen here as well. That if this Federalist proposes it, all Democratic Republicans will say, no, Jonas Platt, that's a terrible idea. They need to make this ideal appealing to Democratic Republicans and bring a prominent Democratic Republican on board. So they will enlist an unlikely ally on March 12th, DeWitt Clinton. This is when he enters the canal story for real. Let's talk a little about DeWitt Clinton, as he will be important throughout the rest of the story. Born to the prominent Clinton family in Ulster County in 1769. He starts out as his Uncle George, his personal secretary. He is governor of New York, pretty much from the time that position is made until George Clinton becomes Thomas Jefferson's vice president after his first vice president murdered someone. It's Aaron Burr. Anywho, Clinton in his own right enters New York State politics, 1798. He's elected to the Assembly, then the State Senate. Then he's appointed to become the U.S. Senator for New York. He occupies a lot of different positions, but most notably, he is mayor of New York City 3 different times. Notably, senator and mayor are both appointed positions at the time. It is convenient to have your uncle be the governor, since he's making those appointments at the time. But anyway, that's not to say nepotism is all that gets Stuart Clinton where he is. He's a brilliant man from most accounts of him, and he's an excellent politician as well. He learns well from his Uncle George, who dominates New York politics for like 25 years, and he soon becomes New York's Democratic Republican kingmaker, especially once his Uncle George goes to Washington to become vice president. So this is a heavy hitter that they brought on board to the canal plan, and the next day they convince him that the canal's a good idea. And Jonas Platt, March 13th, 1810, proposes again a resolution to examine canal routes, and is seconded in the state senate by DeWitt Clinton, which lets Democratic Republicans know you can vote for this bill too. And it passes handily. And then a commission of 7 canal commissioners is appointed. It's a bipartisan commission of some of the most prominent New Yorkers in the state. You have Governor Morris, who wrote the Constitution, notably the preamble, Stephen Van Rensselaer, the richest man in the country at the time, William North, former aide-de-camp of the Baron von Steuben, Thomas Eddy, who we already talked about, DeWitt Clinton, Simeon DeWitt, who's state surveyor general, and Peter Bill Porter, who is a major landholder out in western New York, critically for the Ogden Land Company. I'm surprised, like Joseph Ellicot's ghost in like Scream or something when I brought up Peter Bill Porter, but they were great enemies of one another. Anywho, those 7 commissioners will set out on probably the most famous fact-finding mission in the history of the canal, this tour across New York State. They take about a month to check out all of these different routes. They travel in style. Recent receipts have been found showing just the massive quantities of alcohol that they bring with them. There's also probably apocryphal story that they didn't get the malaria that was endemic in the Montezuma marshes because their boat was constantly surrounded by a thick haze of cigar smoke. But yeah, they have a good time checking out the waterways, but they do also like what they see. There's a lot of potential here. And once they get back, they set to work writing a report, which is submitted March 2nd to the state legislature. It's written by the president of the commission, Governor Morris. Also, like I said, Morris wrote the Constitution, so once you do that, you kind of get assigned all the other writing assignments in group work. And they will recommend, critically, a route to Lake Erie rather than to Lake Ontario. Every commissioner supports this except one, and it's Peter Bill Porter. That is because, well, probably because he owns the portage rights around Niagara Falls. So he would stand to make a lot of money if you could connect Lake Ontario rather than Lake Erie there. But they're going to recommend Lake Erie because if a canal was just built to Lake Ontario, they project that actually most of the trade from New York as well would just go to Lake Ontario and up the river. We would lose trade from a Lake Ontario route, possibly. However, Morris also puts into the report something that will haunt them for years to come. He supports building an inclined plane canal. This would be a canal whose high point was Lake Erie, and there are no locks. It's just a straight downward line all the way to about Schenectady is where they propose it. No locks. This sounds kind of like a good idea, just on paper. It would save time. You don't have to take time through locks. However, the actual engineering of this structure would be almost impossible. It involves like 100-foot high embankments at some points, and also digging out these giant canyons. And people pretty quickly realize that this does not actually make sense, and opponents of the canal will attack this plan even long after it's been written out. But they give this report to the state legislature, who read it, and it looks pretty promising. So, April 8th, they say, yes, the canal commissioners can go try to find funding for the canal. Also, DeWitt Clinton is appointed lieutenant governor at that time, so they have someone in the executive branch now. And they will hire James Geddes again, as well as Benjamin Wright, that former assistant engineer to William Weston in the Western Inland, to survey the routes of the canal. And they get back at the end of that summer, and they say, hey, incline plane's definitely not going to work. You need locks on your canal. And Governor Morris will eventually relent to this. However, he soon after that also resigns from the commission. So he's not super thrilled that he had to do this. But in the meantime, they head down to Washington, D.C., December 21st, to meet with President James Madison and ask again about potential federal funding. Madison seems in favor of it. And in fact, on Christmas Eve, December 24th, he delivers a speech to Congress saying they should approve funding for a bill that will provide funding for a canal in New York, as well as some of these other gallant and planned projects. However, the bill dies due to sectional infighting between the different Congress people. It never gets to the president's desk because, why would a congressman from North Carolina or something, they're not necessarily going to support funding for a canal that just is mainly going to impact New York. This happens to a lot of these sorts of bills over time. Just people are like, I'm not getting anything out of this, I won't vote for it. So January 10th, 1812, that bill dies. However, everyone's going to get distracted for a few years, and the canal kind of takes a back burner to the War of 1812. The War of 1812 will also be critical to the story of the canal. The war itself is greatly hindered by poor transportation networks. It's hard to supply soldiers on the front, and also to communicate with generals and stuff as well. So America suffers a lot of embarrassments as a result, on especially the Niagara frontier. Clinton also will run for president in 1812 on a peace ticket. This hurts him politically because he loses only by Pennsylvania, actually, in the Electoral College, but nonetheless, his political star falls. He allies with the Federalists to try to win election. This doesn't work, and now a lot of folks in New York politics view him as a traitor. The governor at the time, Daniel D. Tompkins, is also not a fan of the canal idea, and he becomes kind of a hero during the War of 1812, enough so that towards the end of the war, he's able to get the Canal Act rescinded. There is no longer this Canal Commission. And then he doesn't reappoint DeWitt Clinton as mayor of New York City. This is a real low point for DeWitt Clinton. However, the war ends. And you have what's known as the era of good feelings afterwards. Americans say we've stood up to the British, again, the greatest empire in the world at the time. And here we are, this free republic, right? They now view it almost as their duty to show the world what a free people can do is often how they will phrase it. So this new enthusiasm for what can America do now following the war really helps revitalize the canal, and also DeWitt Clinton's political fortunes. He starts out on a tour across New York State in July of 1815, talking about the canal again, that culminates on December 3rd, 1815, when he delivers a speech at the City Hotel in New York City, where thousands of people gather. They spontaneously, quote unquote, definitely was written beforehand because it's like 26 pages long, write a memorandum to the state legislature calling for a canal, being like, this is a great idea, and more copies of this are sent across New York State, signed by people across the state, and sent in to the state legislature. And 1815, there's so much momentum behind the canal, that more legislators are elected in 1816. And it's very popular. New York legislators realize they have to address this canal question again. However, we already introduced Daniel D. Tompkins. He's not a fan of the bill. Neither at the time is a young up-and-coming state senator, Martin Van Buren, who largely views DeWitt Clinton as his only real competition for dominance in New York State politics. And he thinks that a canal being good for DeWitt Clinton would be bad for Martin Van Buren, which he's probably right about. So they will fight a 1916 Canal Act. They know something has to be passed, but they make it pretty much toothless. They authorize another survey. At this point, there's been enough surveys. And critically, they don't let the canal commissioners look for funding for a canal. So they can't build it. Which leads us to the critical year, 1817. We're just about done here. February 24th, James Monroe is about to be inaugurated as the 5th President of the United States. And Daniel D. Tompkins is tapped to be his vice president. So he resigns from the governorship to go to Washington to become VP. This doesn't sound great at first glance for the canal story, right? This great detractor of the canal is now theoretically the second most powerful person in the country. However, vice president doesn't mean a lot unless the president dies. So instead, it actually keeps Daniel D. Tompkins out of New York State politics instead, removing him critically from the debate, mostly over the canal. Meanwhile, the last act that James Madison does while president is veto what's known as the bonus bill. This would have provided federal funds to a whole host of federal infrastructure projects. He claims that it is because it is unconstitutional. An amendment needs to be written in that the federal government can provide these sorts of funds. Others argue it's because he was Virginian. You can believe whatever you want to. Either way, with the bonus bill vetoed, it's very apparent there's no federal money that's going to come to New York State to build this canal. So New York decides, let's try to take it upon ourselves. The canal is still very popular, especially with voters in upstate. So March 19th, an act to build the canal between the Mohawk and Seneca rivers is presented to the state assembly. It takes a while to get through, but on April 10th, the bill passes the assembly. A few days later, it is read to the Senate. They have a night to digest it. And on April 15th, 1817, the last day of the state's legislative session for the year, the Senate votes on the bill. They make a few amendments. And at 10 a.m., the Senate returns an amended bill to the Assembly, who has to then approve those amendments. They do. And it gets returned to the Senate at 11:20, and it's read to the Senate, at which point Josiah Ogden proposes sending that bill to a committee to look it over. The This is a good way to kill any legislation, even with a lot of time. They only have about 40 minutes to pass this bill. Ogden is loudly booed down, however, by the state legislators, and his motion is handily defeated. However, the Senate, it's a very neck and neck thing, sort of, whether people are going to submit it. But then critically, they make a slight amendment. They say, yeah, we're not going to spend the money to buy out the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company, which the Assembly rejects that. It gets sent back to the Senate. This is when the critical moment happens. Martin Van Buren stands up. Martin Van Buren is one of the greatest politicians in American history. Not like that he was a good guy, he just knew how to play politics better than almost anyone else. Remember, he had killed that 1816 bill, sort of. Not killed it, but made it pretty ineffective. Daniel D. Tompkins just hated the canal. Martin Van Buren didn't fully care about the canal, he just loved Martin Van Buren. So, he kicked the can down the road in 1816. But now, they're at this critical juncture, right? If the Senate says, no, you have to buy out the Western Inland, the bill's going to be killed. Martin Van Buren stands up and delivers an impassioned but short speech in favor of the canal, and all of his political allies then vote for it. So now, instead of being this villain in the canal story, Martin Van Buren gets to be the man who saved the canal instead. And he will very much play on that for much of the next 10 years of American politics. A vote's called, and the Senate ultimately passes the bill by the slimmest of margins. Critically, no representatives in the Assembly or the Senate from Westchester County South will vote in favor of the bill. Some abstain, but this is notable because New York City will probably benefit the most of anywhere from the canal. And nowadays, that bill would just go to the governor's desk. But back then, there was what was known as the Council of Revision, a group of 4 men who pretty much were allowed to veto bills that they didn't like if they wanted them. And it was equally split amongst pro-canal candidates. We already talked about Jonas Platt, as well as future Governor Joseph Yates, and then people assumed to be against the canal, James Kent and Smith Thompson. So it seems like there'd be a tie. What happens in that case? The governor would break the tie, and that is a man by the name of John Taylor, a protege of Daniel D. Tompkins. So it looks pretty bad for the canal, right? So the bill goes to the Council of Revision, and Platt and Yates just kind of try stalling, praying for a miracle. And the miracle does happen, sort of, in the form of Daniel D. Tompkins. No longer governor, shouldn't be in the room at all, but he is, this well-respected figure in New York State politics. He enters the room. Tompkins, while vice president, will develop a very serious drinking habit. Who knows how he's doing at this point in time. But anyway, he's going to go into this room and tell the Council of Revision they need to vote against this canal bill. Instead, they need to start investing their money in further defensive improvements to New York Harbor and on the Canadian frontier. He thinks war with Canada is yet again imminent. What he does not account for is that this man, James Kent, grew up, he saw the revolution firsthand, and grew to detest violence. He was an ardent pacifist. And he delivers this line after that speech. If we are to have war or have a canal, I am in favor of the canal, and I vote for the bill. So it passes the Council of Revision, 3-1. The governor signs it, and the canal is now a fait accompli. In April, the commissioners start making the first official decisions on the route of the canal. May 7th, James Geddes and Benjamin Wright are consulted and hired on as the chief engineers on the project. In May, DeWitt Clinton will defeat Peter Buell Porter to become the governor of the state. He wins with about 98% of the vote. He's swept into office by this. And on June 27th, John Seymour of Rome is given the first contract for the canal. However, he's told to hold off for a little bit so they can start digging the canal in Rome on July 4th, 1817, when Judge John Richardson turns the first shovelful of canal dirt. The rest is history. So, there you have it. Any questions?
Wow.
Thank you.
That's a lot coming.
Yes, I know, it's a big
I
job.
never heard any of that.
Yeah,
And thank you for it.
thank you.
Well, we did hear about the guy who was in debtor's prison.
Right, you
Joshua
heard that.
Holland, yeah. Any questions? Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed the first few minutes, but DeWitt Clinton, well, was he mayor of New York City, what, 2-3 times? So his big push was trade from New York City to the Great Lakes, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah.
He saw it as he could see what it would do for New York and make both the city incredibly wealthy and the rest of the state. Clinton also is constantly trying to figure out how to make himself president of the United States. So that would have burnished his reputation. Unfortunately for him, died before the next presidential election.
Wasn't expecting that one.
No, that was a ruined plan. Any other questions?
Information overload.
Yeah,
That's
fair
about
enough.
it.
Well, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming out. And,
Thank you for coming.
All right, well, thank you again, Derrick, for all of that information.
Yes.
There'll be a test later, don't
And I would say, looking at,
Yes.
I would say, looking at your notes, you
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Tomorrow night is our downtown ghost stories. If you're interested in that, at 7 o'clock. Then Friday is our last downtown ghost walks. There's still a couple spots left if anybody's interested. They're at 7 and 7:30. We meet down at Goark. And then we've got our last Job with Joe for the season on the 23rd. So next Thursday, Claudia Newstein from the county forest will be here to talk about the history of it being the oldest county forest in New York State. So that'll be at 9 a.m. And then we have the last West Side Ghost Walks on the 24th at 7:30, and there are still some spots available for that. And then it's Wonderland tree season, so
Yeah.
we will hopefully see you all at that. The opening will be the 21st. We've got music, we've got food, we've got all the baskets getting all round up, and the place will be full of Christmas trees for sure. So,
Thank you.
all right, everybody have a great night. We will see you the next time.
Thank you.